She had the locks changed before the flowers on the graves had even wilted. I stood on the porch of the house I had lived in for 29 years, holding a grocery bag of my mother's blood pressure medication that nobody needed anymore, and my key didn't turn. My sister Renata opened the door in our mother's cardigan, holding a glass of our father's good scotch, and told me the vineyard was hers now. The house, the equipment, the label, the distribution contracts, all $41 million of it, in her eyes anyway. She wanted me packed and gone by the weekend. What she didn't know, what none of us knew until a woman named Priscilla Okafor opened a second folder in a conference room that smelled like fresh coffee and old paper, is that our parents had never planned to leave her $41 million at all. They had left her something much smaller, wrapped around a lesson she was about to learn the hardest way a person can learn anything. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time. I'm going to tell you about Delphine, 36, the daughter who stayed behind to run the family vineyard while her sister chased a bigger life somewhere else. When their parents died within 11 days of each other, the sister who left came home and tried to take everything, believing blood alone made her the rightful heir. She had no idea that our parents had spent 7 quiet years building a wall around what mattered most, a wall with exactly one door, and that door had Delphine's name carved into it. Stay to the end, because the moment the second envelope opened changed everything in that room, and it might change how you think about the people in your own life who stayed while everyone else left. If stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe now, because we tell them every week. The family and the land. The Whitlock family had owned Cascade Hollow Vineyard for 38 years, tucked into the folds of the Willamette Valley in Oregon, where the fog rolled off the hills every morning like something alive and the soil held just enough clay to make the Pinot Noir taste like it had opinions. My grandfather had planted the first 3 acres with cuttings smuggled out of Burgundy in a suitcase lined with wet burlap, or so the family story went, embellished a little more every Thanksgiving. My father, Walter Whitlock, took those 3 acres and turned them into 90, built a tasting room out of reclaimed barn wood, and spent 2 decades convincing sommeliers in Portland and then in New York that Oregon could compete with anywhere on earth. My mother, June, ran every number that came through that vineyard for 30 years, the payroll, the barrel costs, the insurance on equipment that broke down exactly when you couldn't afford it to. When her hands started giving her trouble around her 60th birthday, she didn't hire an outside bookkeeper. She taught me. I was 24 when I came home from Portland State with a business degree and a boyfriend who didn't survive the transition back to rural life, and I never really left again. 10 years I spent learning that vineyard the way you learn a person you love, not all at once but in small accumulated moments. I knew which block of vines needed extra irrigation during a dry August. I knew which distributor paid net 30 and which one you had to chase down every single quarter. I knew the exact week the label redesign almost bankrupted us in 2019 and how my mother and I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning restructuring a loan so my father never had to know how close we'd come to losing the harvest equipment. I ran the books, negotiated with the co-packer for our reserve bottling, and sat in on every meeting with our distributor in California. My father used to introduce me at industry dinners not as his daughter but as the person who actually keeps this place running, and I used to feel a small glow of pride every time he said it, even though some quiet part of me wondered if it meant I'd become invisible in every other sense. My sister Renata was 4 years older than me and left the valley the week she turned 19. She said the smell of fermenting grapes made her sick, which might have been true, but what was truer was that she wanted lights and noise and a life that didn't smell like dirt. She moved to Los Angeles, worked briefly as a talent assistant, then pivoted into what she called wellness consulting, which as far as I could tell meant selling supplements to people on Instagram. She married a man named Trent Calloway, an entertainment lawyer with a jaw like a cartoon hero and a smile that never quite reached past his teeth. They divorced after 4 years. She remarried a personal trainer named Blake, divorced him too, and by the time our parents died she was engaged to a man she'd known for 8 months, a real estate developer from San Diego named Curtis Ames, who I had met exactly twice and disliked both times with an intensity that surprised me. Every Christmas, Renata called. Every birthday, she called. And nearly every time, somewhere in the conversation, there would be a mention of a business opportunity that had fallen through, or a rent increase, or a medical bill, and my parents would quietly wire her money. 3,000 here. 8,000 there. Once, when Curtis needed capital for a development deal that never materialized, it was $22,000, and my father didn't tell my mother for 6 weeks because he knew what she'd say. I asked him once, standing in the crush pad during harvest with grape must up to our elbows, why he kept giving money to a daughter who visited maybe once every 2 years and called mostly when she needed something. He wiped his hands on his apron and said, because she's still my Renata, Delphine. Even the parts of her I don't understand. I never forgot that sentence. I understand it differently now than I did then. The accident. It happened on a Tuesday in early October, right in the thick of harvest, when every hour mattered and the crew was picking Pinot blocks before an early frost could ruin the fruit. My father had gone into Salem that morning for a meeting with our insurance broker about renewing the equipment policy, and my mother had gone along because she wanted to visit the pharmacy for a refill. On Highway 22, a logging truck lost part of its load on a curve. My father swerved to avoid the debris, and their car went into the guardrail and down a short embankment. He was killed instantly. My mother lived for 9 days in a hospital in Salem with injuries the doctors described in a language I made myself learn overnight so I could understand every update the nurses gave me. I sat beside her bed those 9 days, holding her hand, running the harvest by phone with our vineyard manager, Hector, because the grapes did not care that my mother was dying. On the 9th day, her heart simply stopped trying. I called Renata from the hospital parking garage at 11 at night. Her phone rang 4 times before she picked up, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Is it bad?" Like, how bad? Not, is she going to be okay? Not, should I come now? Just bad, like she was asking about weather. I told her our mother had died 20 minutes earlier. There was a silence on the line, and then she asked, in a voice that had gone strangely flat and businesslike, whether the will had already been read. I told her our parents hadn't even been buried yet. She said she'd be there as soon as she could get a flight. I handled everything. The funeral home, the double casket order because somehow that felt like the only way to keep them together, the obituary in the Statesman Journal, the reception at the community hall that half the valley showed up to because my parents had spent decades building something that people in that town genuinely loved. I called Priscilla Okafor, our family's estate attorney in Salem, the woman who had drawn up every contract my parents ever signed. I called our distributor to explain there would be a short delay in shipments. I kept the crew picking, because unpicked Pinot on the vine during an early frost is a business decision that doesn't wait for grief. Renata arrived 4 days later, and she did not arrive alone. Curtis Ames got out of the rental car first, sunglasses pushed up into his hair, and stood in the gravel driveway looking at the vineyard rows the way I imagine he looked at undeveloped lots he was pricing for demolition. The homecoming. Renata stepped out of that car in a black dress that had clearly been chosen for how it photographed rather than for a funeral, and heels that immediately sank into the gravel. She looked up at the farmhouse, at the tasting room beyond it, at the rows of vines running toward the tree line, and said, "God, it's smaller than I remembered." No hug for me at first. That came a beat later, stiff and quick, more obligation than comfort. Curtis was already walking toward the crush pad, phone out, snapping pictures of the equipment shed like he was building a mental inventory. He paused at the wine cave entrance my father had blasted into the hillside himself with a rented excavator over 2 brutal summers, and I watched him tap something into his phone. Later I would learn it was a note to a colleague about acreage potential. Renata found me in the kitchen an hour after they arrived. She had already been through my father's filing cabinet in the small office off the mudroom. "Where's the actual paperwork?" she said, not even really a question, more of a demand dressed as a question. "The deed, the LLC documents, the will." I told her Priscilla had everything and the will would be read formally once probate opened. Renata leaned against the counter, our mother's counter, the one where June Whitlock had rolled out pie crust every October for 3 decades for the harvest crew, and said, "I already talked to a lawyer in San Diego. Curtis's guy. As the oldest child, I have primary claim here." That's just how California and Oregon law works for family businesses without explicit succession documents. I asked her what explicit succession documents meant to her, since she'd clearly memorized the phrase from somewhere. She smiled, and it was not a warm smile. It means, she said, that you've been the help around here for 10 years, Delphine, and now the help doesn't get to decide what happens next. I didn't raise my voice. I told her we could discuss all of it once Priscilla read the will. She said there was nothing to discuss, because she already knew what it would say. By the next morning she had called a locksmith from Salem. I came to the front door with 2 coffee mugs, one for her, out of habit more than affection, and found the key didn't turn. I knocked. She opened the door in my mother's cardigan sweater, an old cream-colored thing my mother had worn every autumn for as long as I could remember, and said, "Oh. You're still trying that door?" I told her I had lived in that house for 29 years. She said, "Lived. Past tense, Delphine. It's under new management." She said it lightly, almost playfully, like she was announcing a restaurant reopening rather than evicting her own sister 6 days after burying both their parents. I went around to the back mudroom, packed 2 suitcases with clothes, my laptop, and every accounting file I could carry, and moved into the small guest cottage behind the barrel room, the one my parents had built years ago for visiting cellar interns during harvest season. It had 1 room, a kitchenette, and a shower with water pressure that had never quite recovered from a plumbing repair in 2016. I stood in the doorway of that cottage that first night and looked back at the farmhouse. Every light was on. I could hear music through the open windows, something loud and unfamiliar that had never been played in that house in my lifetime. Through the kitchen window I heard Renata's voice, bright and certain, telling Curtis to start calling commercial real estate contacts, because she wanted, in her words, a real conversation about what this land is actually worth to a developer before the week was out. The pressure campaign. The cottage had 1 window that faced the vine rows, and I set my laptop up on an old wine crate turned sideways as a desk. I called Priscilla Okafor first thing the next morning. "When is the will reading scheduled?" I asked her, and there was something careful in the pause before she answered. "Next Wednesday," she said. "All named parties need to be present." She repeated the phrase "all named parties" in a way that felt deliberate, like she wanted me to notice it without her having to explain why. I asked if there was anything I should prepare. She told me to bring every financial record I had, going back as far as I could manage. 10 years of ledgers, invoices, distributor contracts, tax filings. I didn't understand yet why my bookkeeping would matter to a will reading, but I trusted her enough to start pulling files that same afternoon. The days between that call and the Wednesday reading were some of the strangest of my life. Renata moved fast, faster than I expected grief to allow anyone to move. She called our cellar master, a soft-spoken man named Arturo who had worked every harvest with us for 11 years, and told him his position was being restructured, effective immediately, pending the sale. Arturo came to find me at the cottage with his cap in his hands, more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "Miss Delphine," he said, "she is saying the vineyard is selling. Is this true?" I told him nothing was decided, that the will hadn't been read, and that I couldn't promise him anything except that I would fight for his job with everything I had. He nodded, but I could see the fear sitting behind his eyes, the fear of a man with a family who had just watched his employer's daughter start giving orders like she already owned the deed. Renata called our distributor in Sacramento and tried to renegotiate our exclusive contract terms without any legal authority to do so. The distributor, a woman named Priya Subramaniam who had worked with my mother for 15 years, called me directly, baffled. "Delphine, what on earth is going on over there? Your sister is on the phone asking me to draft a termination clause like she's already running the place." I explained as simply as I could that Renata believed she had inherited everything before any legal process had confirmed it. Priya was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your mother would have had something very pointed to say about this. Don't worry about the contract. I'm not signing anything until the actual owner tells me to." Curtis, meanwhile, spent his days on the phone with commercial agents and once, loudly enough that I heard it from the cottage across the courtyard, quoted a number, 41 million, conservatively, once we get the zoning variance for the ridge lots. He had clearly already walked the property with a mental measuring tape, calculating how many luxury home sites could replace 90 acres of vines that had taken my grandfather and father a combined lifetime to cultivate. I sat in that cottage some nights and felt something colder than grief settle into my chest, a kind of quiet fury at watching people treat my family's life's work as a spreadsheet line item to be liquidated before the ink on the death certificates had even dried. The town turns. Word travels fast in a valley that small. By the end of that first week, I noticed people at the co-op supply store looking at me differently, not hostile exactly, but careful, the way you look at someone when you've heard a story about them and haven't decided how much of it to believe. A woman named Carol, who ran the farm stand 2 properties down, stopped me in the parking lot and said, "I heard your sister's having a tough time getting what's owed to her." I asked where she'd heard that. Carol said Renata had been at the diner in town telling anyone who'd listen that I had cut her out of the family for years, isolating our parents on the property so she couldn't maintain a relationship with them. Isolated. My parents, who drove into town every single Sunday for church and lunch afterward at the same diner for 20 years. My parents, who hosted the Harvest Festival every autumn for the entire community. My parents, who knew the name of every checkout clerk at the grocery store on Main Street. Curtis had apparently also been busy on social media, posting something vague about a family business dispute and one sibling trying to control a family legacy while the other just wants fairness, phrased carefully enough to sound sympathetic without naming anyone directly, though everyone in that town knew exactly who he meant. I didn't respond publicly to any of it. I went back to the cottage, checked the fermentation temperatures in the tanks, reviewed Hector's picking schedule for the remaining blocks, and did the work, because the grapes did not care about Instagram posts. One afternoon I checked the mailbox at the end of the long gravel driveway, still registered in my parents' names, and found among the sympathy cards a thick envelope from a firm called Ridgeline Capital Partners, based out of San Diego. I opened it sitting on the tailgate of my truck. It was a formal letter of intent to purchase the entire 90-acre property for $41 million, addressed to Renata Whitlock Ames as owner, and signed at the bottom in her looping handwriting. I read it twice, slowly, because I wanted to be certain I understood what I was looking at. My sister had signed a binding letter of intent to sell a property she had zero legal claim to, before probate had even opened, before any court or attorney had confirmed a single thing about who inherited what. I called Priscilla immediately and read her the letter over the phone. There was a long pause on her end, and then she said, in the same careful, controlled voice she'd used all week, "She can sign whatever she wants, Delphine. Until this estate clears probate and the relevant instruments are executed, she has zero authority to transfer, encumber, or sell a single acre of that property. Keep that letter. Bring it Wednesday." Then she added, almost gently, "Everything will make sense Wednesday. I promise you that." The buyout attempt. 2 nights before the will reading, I was reviewing quarterly tax estimates on my laptop when the cottage door opened without a knock. Curtis stood in the frame, one shoulder leaning against the wood, wearing the kind of smile that men like him seem to practice in mirrors. "Got a minute, Delphine?" he asked, already stepping inside without waiting for an answer. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Renata and I have been talking. We want to make this easy for everyone involved." He unfolded the paper on the wine crate desk. $60,000, in exchange for signing away any claim to the estate, effective immediately, before the reading even happened. I told him the property alone was worth more than 600 times that figure. He shrugged, the way you shrug at someone you've already decided doesn't matter. "It was never yours to begin with," he said. "You were staff." "Skilled staff, sure, but staff. Be realistic. You're living in a converted shed with a bad shower, and you have no money to hire lawyers who can compete with the ones we've already retained." I set my pen down and looked at him directly. "Then we'll let Wednesday decide that," I said. His expression shifted, just slightly, the salesman veneer sliding for half a second to reveal something meaner underneath. "You really want to drag this out," he said. We have people in San Diego who know how to make things very difficult for people who don't cooperate. I told him, again, that Wednesday would tell us everything we needed to know. He stared at me a long moment, then turned and left, pulling the door shut hard enough to rattle the single window. Sitting alone afterward, I found myself thinking less about what he'd said and more about how he'd said it. There was something underneath his aggression that wasn't confidence at all. It was nerves. Curtis Ames was scared of Wednesday, not excited about it, and I found myself wondering, for the first time, what exactly he already suspected that he hadn't told Renata. The letter under the bed. I couldn't sleep that night. Around midnight, restless in the way I get when my mind won't settle, I started rearranging the cottage the way I used to rearrange my childhood bedroom whenever something was bothering me. I pulled the small cot away from the wall to sweep behind it, and my hand caught the edge of a box, cardboard, dusty, the kind my mother used for storing extra bottling corks and label proofs. It had probably been sitting there since the last seller in turn used this cottage 2 summers ago. I almost pushed it aside without a second look, but the lid had my mother's handwriting on it, the same distinctive slant she always used when she was tired and writing late at night. She'd labeled it Cellar Supplies, but inside there were no supplies at all. Just a cream-colored envelope, tucked closed rather than sealed, with my name written across the front in her hand. I sat on the floor of that cottage and read it by the light of my phone. Delphine, it began, if you are reading this, things have likely gone the way your father and I feared they might. Renata will try to take everything, and she may say things that hurt you. Don't fight her with arguments, sweetheart, she has always been better with words than either of us, and she will out-talk you every time if you let her. Let the documents speak instead. Priscilla has everything you need. Trust her, and trust what you have built out there in those vines, because we built it to be trusted with you. Love always, Mom. I read it 4 times. I could picture her writing it, alone at the kitchen table after my father had gone to bed, the single lamp making its small circle of light on the wood, choosing each word with the same care she gave every ledger entry for 30 years. She had known. She had known exactly what would happen, and she had protected me from beyond a moment she hadn't yet lived to see. I folded the letter, tucked it into my shirt pocket, and sat there until the first gray light came up over the ridge. The morning of the reading. I was up before 5 that Wednesday, out among the vines with a flashlight checking the last of the fermentation tanks, feeding the small flock of chickens my mother had kept for no reason other than that she liked the sound they made in the mornings. There was comfort in the routine, in the fact that none of it cared about wills or sisters or lawyers, it simply needed tending, and I could give it that. I showered in the cottage's temperamental water pressure and dressed in a plain button-down shirt and dark slacks, the same outfit I wore whenever I met with our bank or our distributor. Not dressed up. Dressed like someone whose job this was. Through the small window I watched Renata and Curtis loading into the rental car in the farmhouse driveway. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and sunglasses, like she was walking into a press conference rather than a legal reading. Curtis wore a sport coat that pulled tight across his shoulders and a tie I suspected he'd borrowed for the occasion. They both moved like people who had already won. My phone buzzed. It was Hector, our vineyard manager, texting simply, "You've got this, boss." I gathered my binder of 10 years of financial records, the small flash drive with every digital backup, and my mother's letter, still folded in my shirt pocket, and walked out past the farmhouse where the rental car idled in the gravel. Renata glanced at me through the tinted window. She didn't wave. I got into my own truck, the same dented Ford I'd driven for 6 years with a co-op parking sticker on the bumper, and drove the 20 minutes into Salem, toward whatever was waiting. The conference room. Priscilla Okafor's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted brick building on Court Street, above a small bakery whose smell of cinnamon rolls drifted up through the stairwell every morning. I had been there a dozen times over the years for contract reviews and tax filings. Today the conference room door stood open, and Priscilla stood at the head of a long table with a leather portfolio and a glass of water, her expression giving away nothing. She nodded when I walked in. "Morning, Delphine." Priya Subramaniam, our distributor, was already seated, hands folded, and beside her sat Hector, looking uncomfortable in a collared shirt he clearly didn't wear often. They both gave me small, steady nods, the kind that told me they had been briefed on more than I had. Renata and Curtis arrived 7 minutes later. Renata stopped in the doorway when she saw the room, her eyes moving from Priya to Hector with visible confusion. "Why are they here?" she said, "not to me, to the room in general." Priscilla answered without looking up from her portfolio. "They're named in the relevant documents." Renata's jaw tightened. She looked at Curtis, who shrugged in a way that seemed to say don't worry about it, and pulled out a chair anyway. Renata took the seat at the center of the table, crossed her legs, folded her hands on the surface with the poise of someone who had rehearsed this exact posture in a mirror. Priscilla opened her portfolio and produced a stack of documents far thicker than the 2 or 3 pages Renata had clearly been expecting. I watched my sister's eye twitch, just slightly, at the size of that stack. "Before we begin," Priscilla said, "I want to clarify that the estate documents your parents left consist of 2 separate instruments. We will read the first one now." 2 instruments. The room seemed to shift slightly at the phrase, though only I and Priya and Hector seemed to register its weight. Renata had spent an entire week telling half the town she was inheriting a $41 million vineyard, and she had no idea yet that the document about to be read had already been split, by design, into 2 very different conversations. Priscilla adjusted her glasses and began reading. "Last will and testament of Walter James Whitlock and June Marie Whitlock." She read slowly, deliberately, in the voice of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment. Part 1, Direct Bequests. To our daughter, Renata Whitlock Ames, we leave the family farmhouse at 4420, Hollow Ridge Lane, including all furnishings and personal property contained therein, and the sum of $310,000 from the joint account at Willamette Valley Bank. Renata exhaled audibly, a small triumphant breath, and turned to me with a look that seemed to say, "See, I told you." Curtis squeezed her hand beneath the table. Priscilla continued without pause. "This bequest is subject to the following condition. Renata Whitlock Ames must reside at the property continuously and maintain it in habitable condition for a period of no less than 5 years from the date of this will's execution. Failure to meet this condition results in the property reverting fully to the Whitlock family trust." Renata's smile cracked at the edges. 5 years, she repeated. "I'm not living out here for 5 years." Curtis leaned toward her and murmured something about figuring it out later, and then asked, louder, "What else? What about the vineyard itself?" Priscilla looked at them both evenly. "That concludes part 1. Renata blinked several times. "That's it? A house and $300,000? The property alone is worth tens of millions." Priscilla folded her hands. "The house and the account are what part 1 designates." "Yes." The number sat in the air like something physical. $310,000, when Renata had spent the past week telling a real estate developer the land was worth $41 million and telling half our hometown she was the rightful heir to everything. Curtis's face had gone rigid. "Where's the rest?" he said, standing halfway out of his chair. "The acreage, the equipment, the label, the distribution rights. There's tens of millions in assets unaccounted for." "Where is it?" Priscilla didn't flinch. "That is addressed in part 2. Renata turned to me, eyes narrowed. "You knew about this. You set this up with her." I kept my voice level. "I'm hearing this for the first time, exactly like you." It was the truth. I had my mother's letter in my pocket, and it had told me to trust the process, not what the process would ultimately reveal. The second envelope. Priscilla reached into her portfolio and withdrew a second document, heavier than the first, sealed with a notary stamp, printed on a slightly different stock of paper. She held it up so the room could see it clearly. "Part 2, she said. "This instrument was filed separately, 7 years ago. It is legally distinct from the will we just read." She broke the seal. The sound was small, just paper tearing, but in that quiet room it landed like something much larger. Renata stared at the envelope as though it had personally wronged her. Curtis sank back into his chair slowly. Hector shifted in his seat. Priya's eyes flicked to me and held for half a second. Your parents established the Whitlock Family Irrevocable Trust in March of 7 years ago, Priscilla read. Her voice stayed even, professional, but I could hear something underneath it, the satisfaction of a person who had waited a long time to read this exact document aloud. The trust encompasses the following assets. 90 acres of agricultural and vineyard property registered as Cascade Hollow Vineyard, including all structures, equipment, cellar improvements, and the associated wine label and trademark. Equity holdings in the distribution agreement with Subramanian Wine Imports. The Whitlock Agricultural Scholarship Fund, currently valued at approximately $1.8 million. She looked up briefly. The total estimated value of trust assets, as of the most recent quarterly appraisal, is approximately $27.4 million. The number landed like a stone dropped into still water. $27 million. Not in the will. In a trust. Established 7 years earlier, while both my parents were alive, clear-minded, and entirely capable of making decisions. Renata's face went white, not flushed with anger but drained entirely of color. 27 million, she whispered. Priscilla nodded once. Your parents planned this very deliberately, Renata. The trust was created, funded, and executed years before their deaths. Curtis gripped the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles went the same pale color as Renata's face. I sat very still, my hands in my lap, my mother's letter warm against my chest through the cotton of my shirt. Let the papers do the talking. The trustee conditions. The trust designates a single trustee, Priscilla continued. Renata straightened immediately. That's me, she said, before Priscilla had even finished the sentence. I'm the eldest. Obviously it's me. Priscilla looked at her over the top of her glasses. Please let me finish reading the conditions. She read them one at a time, and each condition landed like another nail in a structure Renata hadn't realized she was building around herself all week. The trustee must be a person who has resided on the Cascade Hollow property continuously for no less than 5 years prior to the grantor's deaths. A pause. The trustee must have maintained verifiable financial and operational records of the vineyard's business activities during that period. Another pause. The trustee must demonstrate an active, ongoing relationship with the vineyard's distribution and agricultural community partners, as independently verifiable. The room went utterly silent, not the polite silence of a formal meeting but the loaded silence of people doing arithmetic they didn't want to finish. Renata had not lived on that property in 17 years. She had never kept a single financial record for the business. She had no relationship whatsoever with our distributor or our agricultural cooperative. She met exactly 0 of the 3 conditions, and everyone in that room besides her and Curtis had already worked that out. This is absurd, Renata said. Who wrote these conditions? Your parents, Priscilla said simply. With my legal counsel, 7 years ago. Curtis stood fully now, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood. This was clearly written to exclude Renata specifically. We will absolutely be contesting this. Priscilla's tone didn't shift at all. An irrevocable trust is exceptionally difficult to contest, Mr. Ames. This instrument was executed while both grantors were of sound mind, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized under the laws of the state of Oregon. She glanced toward Priya, then toward Hector. Both witnesses are present in this room today. They hadn't simply been named somewhere in a document. They had physically stood in this exact office 7 years earlier and watched my parents sign away $27 million into a structure designed, quietly and deliberately, to protect the vineyard, the town, and the daughter who had actually stayed to build it. Renata unravels. Renata's chair scraped back hard as she stood, hands flat on the table, leaning forward as though sheer force of will could rewrite the paper in front of her. This is a setup, she said, her voice climbing. Delphine manipulated them. She isolated them out here so nobody else could ever get close to them. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. Priya spoke first, quiet but unshaken. Walter and June drove into town every Sunday for church and lunch for over 20 years, Renata. Nobody isolated them from anything. Hector added, more gently, and Delphine has run this vineyard's books for 10 years. Every invoice, every payroll cycle, every tax filing, on time. I've seen it firsthand. Renata pointed a shaking finger at me. She told them exactly what to do. She controlled everything. Priya shook her head slowly. Your parents made this decision with completely clear eyes, hun. I sat right here when they signed it. Your mother cried that day, not because she was confused, but because she already knew exactly how this moment would go, and she loved you anyway. That landed somewhere real, even for Renata. Her finger dropped. Her mouth opened and nothing came out for several long seconds. Curtis, meanwhile, had gone very quiet, and I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the way a person looks when the numbers they'd been counting on have just collapsed. This is insane, he finally said, loud in the stillness. We had a buyer lined up already. Ridgeline Capital was ready to close at $41 million. There were subdivision plans in motion, 110 residential lots. Silence again, deeper this time. Every person in that room turned to look at Curtis Ames, the fiancé who had walked onto a grieving family's property the week after a double funeral and started measuring vineyard rows for a housing development. Renata rounded on him. Curtis, shut up. But it was already out. Priscilla's voice cut through, precise as a scalpel. Mr. Ames, you have just admitted to negotiating the sale of a property you had zero legal claim to. Depending on the representations made to Ridgeline Capital in that process, that may well constitute fraud. His face went red, and for a moment the confident developer disappeared entirely, replaced by a man realizing exactly how much trouble he'd talked himself into. The parents' letter. Priscilla let the silence settle before continuing. There is one final section, she said. A personal letter your parents asked me to read aloud to both of you together, regardless of how this reading concluded. Renata was standing in the middle of the room by now, mascara starting to smudge, hands balled into fists at her sides. She looked nothing like the composed woman who had walked in an hour earlier. Priscilla began to read. To our daughters. We loved you both equally, in different ways, because you needed different things from us. Renata, we gave you freedom, the money for your apartments, your fresh starts, more times than we ever counted out loud. We never once asked for it back, and we never will. Delphine, we gave you roots, the land, the work, the responsibility, because we watched you choose this life over and over, every single season, and we wanted to make absolutely certain it would still be here waiting for you. Priscilla's voice stayed level, but I could see a slight tremor at the edge of the page in her hand. She had known my parents for decades. This was not simply a legal document to her either. Renata, we structured the house and the account this way because we know, deep down, that you still need a place to come home to. The 5-year condition is not meant as a punishment. It is an invitation. Come home. Learn what your grandfather and your father actually built here with their hands. If you choose to stay, you will understand, finally, why your sister never left. Priya was crying quietly by this point, tears sliding down without any effort to wipe them away. Even Curtis had gone completely silent, no angle left to play, no deal left to negotiate, just two dead parents telling the plain truth from beyond any argument he could construct. Delphine, Priscilla continued, the trust is not a reward. It is a responsibility, and we know you will carry it, because you always have. Since you were 24 years old, you have kept this vineyard alive through droughts, through recessions, through years when the numbers barely worked at all. You never once asked for credit. You never once asked for more than what was fair. We could not say this while we were living without wounding your sister. We can say it now. You are the one we trust. I didn't move. I let my parents' words fill that quiet room, saying finally what they had never said aloud while alive, not because they hadn't felt it every single day, but because saying it out loud would have meant admitting, in front of both of us, that one daughter had drifted and one had stayed. They had carried that unspoken truth their whole lives and released it only now, in ink, witnessed, notarized, in a form no argument could unravel. The collapse. The silence lasted only a few seconds before Renata broke it entirely. "This is a joke," she said, voice cracking against the walls. "I get a house and $300,000 and she gets 27 million? I'm the oldest. I'm their firstborn." She swept her arm across the table, scattering papers, sending her own purse clattering to the floor. Curtis grabbed her arm. "Renata, we need to leave. Now." She shook him off entirely. "Get off me. This is your fault. You told me signing that letter of intent was standard procedure. You told me this was a sure thing." She rounded on me next, 1 finger inches from my face. "You poisoned them against me. You stole my own parents from me while I wasn't looking." I stood up slowly and looked at my sister, at her smudged makeup, her shaking hands, the designer suit twisted where Curtis had grabbed her arm. She had been the eldest. She had been the one who left. She had spent an entire week calling herself the rightful heir to everything our parents had built, and now she was falling apart in front of the very people who had witnessed my parents choose otherwise, deliberately, years in advance. I said only one thing to her. "The books never lied, Renata. Not once, in 10 years. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Priscilla spoke into the silence that followed. "For the purposes of today's reading, the will and trust are concluded. Should you wish to contest, you will need to file formally with the probate court. I should note that legal fees for challenging an irrevocable trust of this structure typically begin around $75,000, with a documented success rate under 5%. Renata grabbed her purse off the floor. Curtis took her elbow, and this time she let him steer her toward the door without resistance. At the threshold she stopped, looked back at me, and said, "This is not over." The door closed behind them, and the room finally exhaled. Aftermath. Hector stood first, running a hand across his face. "I'm sorry, Delphine, for all of it," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve any of this week." I told him none of us had. Priya came around the table and hugged me, tight and brief, the way you hug someone when there aren't enough words available. "Your mother would be so proud of you right now," she whispered. I told her she had planned this whole thing years in advance. Priya pulled back and looked at me steadily. "She planned it because she knew exactly who you were, sweetheart. She knew you'd be sitting right here, keeping the books, staying put." Hector shook my hand, firm and businesslike, the way we always closed out a harvest season together. "The distribution contracts are safe," I told him. "They were never actually in danger. The trust protects all of it." Priscilla walked me to the window afterward and let me have a quiet moment before speaking. "Your parents were two of the sharpest people I've worked with in almost 30 years of practice," she said. "And they were right about you, every step of the way." I drove back to the vineyard in silence, 20 minutes on familiar roads, past the co-op, past the church, past the elementary school where my mother used to volunteer every spring. The sky over the valley was pewter gray and clear. When I pulled into the driveway, the rental car was already gone. I walked to the farmhouse door. The lock was still the brass one Renata had installed, shiny and out of place against 50-year-old wood. I didn't try it that day. I walked back to the cottage instead, sat on the cot, and unfolded my mother's letter again on the workbench desk. "Trust what you have built here." I looked out the small window at 90 acres of Whitlock land, the rows running north to south the way my father had insisted for maximum sun exposure, the wine cave cut into the hillside, the equipment shed, the small chicken coop my mother had kept simply because she liked the sound in the mornings. My parents had not left me money in the traditional sense. They had left me a mandate, the kind you cannot deposit into a bank account or hand over to a developer or spend in a city you have no plans of ever returning to. 3 months later. Renata did not stay in the farmhouse. She lasted 11 days, 11 days of silence from the community, 11 days of discovering that inheriting a farmhouse also meant inheriting a propane bill, a well pump that needed servicing, and a roof that leaked over the back bedroom during the first real rain of the season. She packed her bags and drove back to San Diego without saying goodbye to anyone in town. Under the terms of the will, she technically still had 5 years to fulfill the residency requirement if she ever chose to return, and her clock, whether she wanted it to or not, was already running. Curtis had larger problems waiting for him. Priscilla forwarded the Ridgeline Capital letter of intent to the relevant county authorities, noting the apparent misrepresentation involved in negotiating a sale of property without any legal claim to it. The last I heard, he had retained a criminal defense attorney of his own, and Renata had reportedly stopped returning his calls entirely, which told me everything I needed to know about how deep that particular partnership had actually run. The Whitlock Agricultural Scholarship Fund issued its first 3 awards that spring, $12,000 each, to local students pursuing degrees in viticulture and rural community development. I signed those checks at my mother's kitchen table, in the farmhouse I had moved back into the week Renata left, with a new lock installed one final time, this one keyed only to me. Renata called once, on a Thursday evening in early spring. I was sitting on the porch watching the last daylight drain off the ridge and almost let it go to voicemail, but answered anyway. She didn't say hello. "Is there any way at all to get more from the trust?" she asked. I told her the trust existed for the vineyard and the community, not for either of us to simply spend down. "So you're just going to sit on $27 million, she said, an old bitterness creeping back into her voice. "I'm going to manage it," I told her, exactly the way Mom and Dad asked me to. There was a long pause, traffic sounds in the background, because Renata was always somewhere in motion, always driving toward the next thing. "This isn't fair," she finally said, quieter than before. I told her the door was still open if she ever wanted to come home, for real this time, not for the inheritance, but for the work itself. Silence again. Then she hung up. I set the phone down on the porch railing and watched the last of the crew moving equipment toward the barn for the night, slow shapes fading into the early dark. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't sad either. I felt something closer to settled, the way land feels after a long, necessary rain, not flooded and not dry, just holding exactly the right amount. Standing on that porch, looking out over 90 acres my grandfather had started with cuttings smuggled in a suitcase, I understood something my parents had never said to me directly while they were alive. They hadn't left me money. They had left me proof, quiet and undeniable, that staying, showing up every single season, doing the invisible work nobody applauds, that was never the same thing as being replaceable. It was the surest form of trust 2 people could offer, and it took a second envelope, opened in a conference room that smelled like fresh coffee, for me to finally see it in writing. That's the story of a changed lock, a second envelope, and a mother's letter tucked inside a dusty box under a cot in a converted cellar cottage. If you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else walked away, I hope this reminded you that it counts for something, even when nobody says it out loud until it's too late to hear. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in Delphine's place, and subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because we bring you a new story just like this one every week.